it's during deep sleep, which actually happens more in the first half of the night, that those memories, those freshly minted memories that you've recently learned and laid down in the brain, deep sleep will hit the save button on those new memories so that you don't forget. So deep sleep strengthens and solidifies those individual memories. But sleep, we've learned, is much more intelligent than we ever imagined, because thereafter, it's dream sleep, it's REM sleep, that takes all of those individual memories and it starts to intelligently collide them and interconnect them. And so after dream sleep, you wake up with essentially a revised mind-wide web of associations every single day. And as a consequence, you are able to divine solutions to previously impenetrable problems. REM sleep provides this emotional first aid. And what seems to happen is that sleep will take in these difficult, often concerning, even painful or traumatic emotional experiences. And dream sleep acts like this beautiful nocturnal soothing balm. And it just takes the sharp edges off those painful, difficult experiences so that you come back the next day and they don't feel as difficult anymore. So in other words, it's not time that heals all wounds, but it's time during sleep that provides that emotional convalescence, as it were. What is dominant, if there's a red thread narrative that runs through from your waking life into your dreaming life, it is emotional themes and concerns. That's the sort of mental health benefit. That's the mental first aid, the emotional first aid. What's remarkable about dreaming, it's the only time during the 24-hour period where your brain shuts off this stress-related neurochemical called noradrenaline. We never see it at any other time, any other stage of sleep, or any time when you're awake. And I propose that what happens during dream sleep, which is remarkable, is that firstly, we know from brain imaging studies that we've done where we put people inside of a scanner and we watch their brain as it lights up as it goes into dream sleep. Emotional centers of the brain and memory centers of the brain are reactivated during dream sleep. But secondly, unlike when you're awake, it's reactivating and playing those memories in a brain state that is devoid of any of this stress-related neurochemical. And so in other words, dream sleep, we sort of put forward as a theory, allows the brain to take this sort of highly charged emotional memory and strip away the bitter emotional rind from the informational orange so that you come back the next day and it's peeled away. And as a consequence, dream sleep has divorced the emotion from the memory because of this neurochemical state, this kind of mollifying, soothing neurochemical bath. You know, you'd never open up a Word document and then create a new set of sort of text, which is the memory, then hit the save button, and then double click it the next day, open it back up, and you can't do anything with it. You can't change it. You can't edit it. That's a ridiculous system of storage, of information storage. And the brain works just like that. When you recall a memory, once you've hit the save button, is not simply permanent and immutable. It's modifiable, and you can change it and modify it, and then you can reconsolidate it. You can resave it. Now it's edited. And that's what therapy does. That's what we think is partly happening with dream sleep. But dream sleep is quite different there. It's this neurochemical strange state that allows you to sort of soothe that memory as well. And as I said, sort of strip away. It's almost like detoxifying the memory of the emotion so that you come back the next day and you have a memory of an emotional event, but it's no longer emotional itself.
When we talk about sleep hygiene, we talk about simple things. So the first and obvious one is I say to people, what time do you go to bed? And if they can't tell me a time, it means they don't have a regular bedtime. Mm-hmm. Or it means they're embarrassed because they know it's too late. So here's the thing. If I fly from here to Hong Kong, it's like 3-4 hours difference. I know that that will be enough to upset my body clock, right? 3 hours is enough to upset my body clock. And some people will go to bed at 9 o'clock one night and midnight another night. And they'll regularly have these fluctuations on a week-to-week basis. We know that if you go traveling somewhere, it takes about 3 weeks for your body clock to reset itself fully if you go on a transatlantic flight, for instance. So if you're constantly every night or 2 nights changing your bedtime, your body is in a constant state of discombobulation. You need the same bedtime. And then you need to give yourself enough time in bed. This business about, I can get away on 7 hours sleep. Yeah, you can probably get away on it, but you're not going to be functioning optimally. So, and I could point you to a lot of studies, but I won't bore you with the details. I'll just say it's got to be 8 hours. Let's just accept you've got to have 8 hours. And let's also accept that if you spend 8 hours in bed, you're not sleeping for 8 hours. So you need to allow a bit of fat on the bone. So maybe spend 8.5 hours in bed. That would be a good point. Now, let's also understand that the part of the body clock, the circadian rhythm that is most rigid, is the time you wake up. You often just wake up at the same time any day. That's hard to control. So you know on a weekend, you're tired as, you've cancelled the alarm, and you still wake up at 6:30 or 7 o'clock, and you want to sleep, but you can't. So if you need to sleep longer, you have to go to bed earlier. You can't rely on sleeping in longer. So that's a very simple rule. Just pick when you are going to wake up, go back 8.5 hours. That's your new bedtime. And that is a strict bedtime every night with no little variation. Then we have some, things like temperature. People don't realize that the optimal sleeping temperature is about 19 degrees C. That's actually really cold.
That's really cool.
So, you get a nice doona, that's a perfect temperature to sleep in. They've got studies that show this repeatedly. And then if you share the bed with a partner, don't use the same doona. Have two separate doonas. But this is something I was first introduced in Scandinavia, and it makes a hell of a lot of sense because it puts an end to these doona wars. And at night time, I mean, you're all about the hormones, so you all know all about these bright lights suppressing melatonin secretion. So at night, after a certain time, there is no overhead lights on. It's only lamps, and I prefer to have red lamps. And, if you've got to get up to, feed a child or something like that in the middle of the night, well, you can have red globes that are even better than just low wattage globes. So red light, it doesn't really suppress your melatonin as much at all. Put filters on your phone and your screens and things like that. So there's a hell of a lot of things that we can do just around our habits of sleep, focusing on temperature, habits, exposure to light, separate doonas, that actually, for most people, will significantly improve their sleep. And because I really don't like drugs. So beyond melatonin, all these ones that we call the Z's or Zopiclone or Zolpidem or these kind of ones, they're, they can induce what we call parasomnias and people acting out their dreams, and they have side effects. We have the benzodiazepine class, which are, stimulate the same receptors as alcohol, and they tend to be addictive. They tend to, habit forming, and they lose their effectiveness over time as well. So people end up dependent on them, and they don't end up with any benefit. So from a pharmacological perspective, sleep is really a dead end. There's no effective strategies that we have long term.
Bright light is a strong stimulus for cortisol levels coming up in the morning. Again, another reason why you want to have bright light stimulation early in the morning when you're getting up, because that allows the cortisol levels to come up, and that's going to time the melatonin levels later in the evening. So remember that cortisol is a very important hormone. It's a steroid hormone. It goes into the cells, goes into the nucleus, and controls about 20% of the genome of your DNA. And so that if you have chronic stress, also remember that chronic stress increases cortisol levels above what they should be, and that can cause problems on down the road. So you want to have enough cortisol, you want to have it at the right time, and you don't want too much of that cortisol. And so again, another important reason why you want to have bright light exposure in the morning to anchor the circadian rhythm and to make sure your cortisol levels are coming up at the right time. There was a paper that was published in 2015. What they measured was the irradiance of the ebook versus the print book. And you can see here we have irradiance on the y-axis, and we have it broken down into wavelengths. What we have here up top is the ebook, and you can see clearly that, especially in the blue range, there's quite a lot of irradiance coming out at that point. What you probably might have a hard time seeing is because it's so low, is looking at a print book in regular light. And you can see clearly that there's a huge difference in the irradiance between the ebook and the regular print book. So again, it would be better for you to read at night using a regular print book. If you look at sleep latency, which is the time it takes for somebody to fall asleep, you'll see that it was much longer in those who were watching the ebook than those who were reading the book in dim light. In the study, it also showed that those subjects that were reading with the ebook felt more sleepy the next day when they got up. In other words, they had more sleep inertia. Let's summarize exactly what the recommendations are. Number one, in the morning, view sunlight as soon after waking up as possible, ideally before 9 o'clock in the morning. Look, there's nothing better than going outside as the sun is coming up. There is much more light outside than you're ever going to be able to generate inside. But if you have an issue where the sun is not up, or it's very cloudy where you live, you can aim for about 10,000 lux. Spend about 20 to 30 minutes a day in the morning. You want to be anywhere between 11 and 15 inches from the light box. So that's one option. But again, nothing beats actually going outside. Remember when we talked about lux, that on a bright sunny day, it's about 100,000 lux. So you can get that very, very quickly. Remember that the photoreceptors in the retina in the morning are not very sensitive. So you need to have very bright light to activate it, but it's kind of integrated over time. So if it's not very bright, you have to spend a longer amount of time. If it's very bright, then you don't have to spend much time at all. If you're in very bright light, 30 seconds may be all that you need if it's 100,000 lux. On a cloudy winter day, like we were just talking about, it could take up to 30 minutes. But again, making sure that you're getting your eyes looking at bright light in the morning. You want to avoid sunglasses. You want to avoid windows. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but especially the low E glass. That's very effective at filtering out infrared light. You don't want windshields. That doesn't really count. You want to get outside and have nothing between you and the light source. Again, avoiding blue blockers. We talked about how blue light stimulation is really key at that time of the day. So make sure that you're getting as much stimulation as possible. In terms of what you should do in the evening time, after the sun goes down, is to limit as much light as possible after sunset. You want to have any kind of light that you have as low as possible. You want to have it as red as possible, and you want to have it as dim as possible so that you can have the benefit of melatonin secretion from the pineal gland when the time is right. Remember what we said, that intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are more activated by blue light. So if you have no choice, if you have to do something, it's better to make sure that the blue light aspect is reduced, either by programming it into the computer or by wearing blue blockers, glasses.
So the reason you get sleepy when you've been up for a while is because adenosine is creeping up steadily the longer you've been awake. And a good way to remember this and think about adenosine is to think about caffeine. Caffeine, for most people, except a very small percentage of people, wakes them up. It makes them feel more alert. Caffeine acts as an adenosine antagonist. What that means is that when you ingest caffeine, whether or not it's coffee or soda or tea or in any other form, it binds to the adenosine receptor. Nothing really happens downstream of that receptor. The receptor can't engage the normal cellular functions of making that cell and you feel sleepy. It blocks the sleepy signal. And this is why when that caffeine wears off, adenosine will bind to that receptor, sometimes with even greater what we call affinity, and you feel the crash. You feel especially tired. Some people can't have any caffeine at all or can't have any caffeine past 11 a.m. or else their sleep is totally disrupted. All of this has to do with the relationship between adenosine and these adenosine receptors, genetic variation, things that are very hard to find out except experimentally, meaning each of you needs to decide and figure out for yourselves whether or not you can tolerate caffeine and at what times of day you can tolerate caffeine in order to still fall asleep easily and get good sleep. So adenosine is driving the sleep hunger. So that when adenosine is high, we really want to fall asleep. However, if you've ever pulled an all-nighter, you'll notice something interesting. As morning rolls around, you'll suddenly feel an increase in your energy and alertness again, even though adenosine has been building up for the entire night. Now, why is that? The reason that is because there's a second force which is governing when you sleep and when you're awake. And that force is a so-called circadian force. And inside all of us is a clock that exists in your brain and my brain and the brain of every animal that we're aware of that determines when we want to be sleepy and when we want to be awake. Our sleep and our period of sleepiness tends to be condensed into one block, typically one 6 to 10 hour block. That block of sleep, and when it falls within each 24-hour cycle, is governed by a number of different things. But the most powerful thing that's governing when you want to be asleep and when you want to be awake is light. And in particular, it's governed by sunlight. Let's start with waking. So regardless of how well you slept at night or whether or not you were up all night, most people tend to wake up sometime around when the sun rises. Maybe not right at sunrise, but within an hour or two or maybe 3 of sunrise. And as we do that, adenosine levels tend to be low if we've been asleep, for reasons that you now understand. And our system generates an internal signal that is in the form of a hormone. The definition of a hormone is it's a substance, a chemical, that's released from one organ in your body that goes and acts on other organs elsewhere in your body, including your nervous system. When you wake up in the morning, you wake up because a particular hormone called cortisol is released from your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands sit right above your kidneys, and there's a little pulse of cortisol. There's also a pulse of some, and when I say a pulse, I just mean the release of a little bit. There's also a pulse of epinephrine, which is adrenaline, from your adrenals and also in your brain, and you feel awake. Now, that pulse of cortisol and adrenaline and epinephrine might come from your alarm clock. It might come from you naturally waking up. But it tends to alert your whole system in your body that it's time to increase your heart rate. It's time to start tensing your muscles. It's time to start moving about. It's very important that that cortisol pulse come early in the day, or at least early in your period of wakefulness. I say that because some people are waking up at 8 p.m. and are sleeping all day. But it's very important that that pulse of cortisol occur early in the day and that it happens all at once. It sort of sets a rising tide of cortisol in your system.
Here's what's interesting. We do lose a lot of other electrolytes besides just sodium and chloride, which is salt, through sweat. We lose iodine at about 50 to 100 micrograms of iodine per liter of fluid loss. We also lose about 40 micrograms of selenium, about 0.4 milligrams of copper, and we also lose some chromium as well. When you lose a mineral, some minerals have really low bioavailability that you need to actually consume 100x of what you lost to regain it back. And so chromium is one of those. Chromium only has a oral bioavailability from the diet or supplement of only 1%. So if you lose, let's say 7 micrograms, because that's typically what you lose, about 7 per hour, you got to consume 700 micrograms to get it back because you're only absorbed 1% through the diet. Heat acclimation is great, but if I do this like a lot, how much minerals am I actually wasting? You just got to make sure you're getting them all back. Yeah, so red light is going to be higher in the sun spectrum early on in the morning and in the evening, whereas you have more UV in the midday. The two best things to help set circadian rhythm and improve sleep are basically the same thing. Get morning sunlight, turn lights off at night. You have to try to match your light patterns to how our body has evolved, because our bodies don't realize that we're in this 21st century of just fake blue light and all these other things that are blasting us and messing up our circadian rhythms. So if you can get outside for 10 minutes upon waking and get some good morning sunlight, and then also to make sure to turn off all the lights at night. Like my neighbors, they all make fun of our house because our house is just completely dark, essentially, by like 6 p.m. That's key though. That's really key. I mean, you can keep some lights on, but they have to be like basically low hanging lights that aren't just like really messing up your circadian rhythm. And when you do that, what ends up happening is the release of melatonin will happen much sooner, and it'll be much greater by getting morning sunlight and turning the lights off at night. And that's going to allow you to sleep better. Yeah, you got to be careful of using red light too close to sleep. But if you use it like, let's say 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, kind of matching like a sunset, that actually might help sleep. But you got to kind of test it out yourself and see, because, you know, how close are you to the red light? Is there different infrared in it as well? How bright is it? Will depend on how it'll affect you. I personally don't think you can always 100% mimic nature and mimic the sun. If you can actually go out and look and sort of like get some light at sunset, that will probably be better for you than trying to mimic it through red light therapy. Based on a lot of my research and publications on a compound called Inositol, something we make from glucose, but we don't do it very well anymore because of numerous factors. We need magnesium to actually make this compound. We get depleted of it through coffee and caffeine and numerous other things. So a lot of us are deficient in this compound. I'm telling you, just taking inositol, like 1 to 2 grams twice a day, 9 out of 10 people that I put on inositol have their deep sleep goes from 30 minutes to like 2 hours and 30 minutes. Like they sleep like the dead on this stuff. So they stay asleep, and it's the deepest sleep they've ever gotten. And part of it is because inositol allows neurotransmitters to be released in the brain, like serotonin, which eventually turns into melatonin. So if you want to release the precursor to melatonin so you can fall asleep, you need inositol compounds to do that. And if you're deficient in it and you take this supplement, it can triple, quadruple your deep sleep.
He hasn't had a piece of fruit in his life. You know, all parents don't necessarily have to do this. But similar to your principles, you start them young, and that's what they go for. You know, he eats eggs every morning. He's never had a refined carbohydrate. But so the main principle is that they have to have the fat soluble vitamins. So they need to get these, you have to work in the fatty meats, you have to work in the organ meats, you have to work in the egg yolks, and the whole fat dairy if they tolerate it. And that's what provides, their bodies are, the literal sponge for these things. It'll create the physiological barrier to tooth decay. So if your child has a hole in their tooth, you can change that. There are cells inside the tooth called the odontoblasts, which are very, very similar to osteoblasts that create bone, and they're an immune cell. And so if they're run by these nutrients, vitamin A, vitamin D, and vitamin K2, so you feed them the protective factors and you remove the harmful factors, and the bodies will start to do it itself. So for tooth decay, that's the first sign of how we're managing calcium balance in a young child. Now, as they grow and develop, you'll start to see whether the teeth have space to come in. Between 6 and 12, for example, but this happens right even when we have just baby teeth, their jaws are developing, and you have 32 human teeth raring to come in. So at 6 and 7, they start to grow. And so what you need to watch is that functionally, they're helping this craniofacial development. We can intervene, we can help the jaws grow. That's what we do in our clinic. We prevent braces, we get to the problem before, and it's all to do with breathing, because when we nasal breathe, and which expands the maxilla, which creates the platform for the upper teeth, which creates a platform for the whole entire craniofacial system, then we create an expansive growth pattern that will then start to create a posture where the child is not mouth breathing. Because if the child mouth breathes, it stunts the growth of the jaw, the maxilla, the roof of the mouth. And what happens is that then you get crooked teeth. If you watch your child, if they're open mouth posture, we need to teach them to breathe through the nose. You really need to watch their sleep, because if they breathe through the mouth through 8 hours of night, this is when all the growth and development is happening. It's where the brain needs all that nitric oxide rich air that goes through the nasal sinuses. If this is all corrected, the nutrients, the breathing, the last factor is the tongue posture. So the craniofacial posture, so tongue to the roof of the mouth, and it's kind of this kind of movement. It's a suction to the roof of the mouth, and that's right back to the soft palate. When you swallow, that creates an upward-outward movement that supports the neck and cervical spine, supports the airway, the oropharyngeal, the throat holds open. You breathe correctly, you create posture. This is why singers have such great craniofacial structure and actors, because they use their voices so well, because their breathing and their airway system is all working well. So when all of those things come together, a child grows and develops. The nutrients that they eat and the air they breathe and the sleep that they get, all of those things come together, and they'll never have a tooth issue. They'll never have wisdom teeth impactions. They won't need braces.
Ethanol is capable of directly causing insulin resistance at the level of the cell and at the level of the whole body in human studies. There are multiple methods for this, or multiple mechanisms that cause, that intermediate, that act as intermediary here, causing the insulin resistance in response to the ethanol. And ceramides are likely an end part. That's the ceramides, as I've discussed previously, directly come in and prevent the phosphorylation or the activation of a critical enzyme called AKT in that insulin pathway. So that's the direct effect. Now let's move on to the indirect effects. And by now you are familiar with my affection for alliteration. And that, so of the 3 indirect effects, I want to talk about sugar, sleep, and substrate. So these are the 3 S's, of the indirect causes of insulin resistance in response to alcohol. All right, so the first one being sugar. The reality of many alcoholic beverages is that they're loaded with sugar. This is cocktails, beers, and some sweet wines. All of them contain either modest to very high amounts of sugar. Consider that in light of some of the human evidence I just mentioned, that when you combine glucose with ethanol, you are amplifying the effect. Ethanol alone isn't eliciting an insulin response. That's probably an important point I should have made. Ethanol alone is not inducing an insulin response, but it's not often consumed alone. It's often consumed with something else, whether it's the sugar in the drink, or whether it's some of the starches in the nuts, or whatever else the person may be eating while they're drinking that alcohol. But again, often sugar is present in some form. And this exaggerates the combination, amplifies the not only glycemic response, resulting in a significantly higher glucose level, but also a significantly higher insulin level. So insulin is working harder and ultimately failing, but all seeking to try to control the blood glucose response. And as you can imagine, as the individual continues to consume alcohol like this, day in, day out, that starts to contribute to a more chronic settling in of insulin resistance. Now let's move on to the next one. Sugar is an obvious one, but let me just again state it, that the excessive consumption of carbohydrates results in insulin resistance. Human evidence has shown that that high carb consumption can cause insulin resistance in just as little as 7 days. Also, if you have healthy insulin sensitive people eat just about 300 grams of carbs, which is not hard to do, their insulin is elevated for up to 10 to 12 hours. So it's easy to see how you can start stacking on these chronic insulin bumps, whereas one individual insulin spike isn't inherently pathogenic. It's when you continue to do this, which most people do, because most people consume a lot of refined starches and sugars, and they do so very often. Okay, so sugar is the first one of the indirect effects of alcohol causing insulin resistance. The next one is sleep. This one is surprising to most people because most people consider that alcohol consumption helps people sleep. What is true, and we'll cite a couple specific studies in a moment, is that alcohol increases or rather reduces the length of time it takes to fall asleep. In other words, people will fall asleep more quickly. But the impact of alcohol on sleep quality is that it disrupts sleep patterns and reduces overall sleep quality. And overwhelmingly, people will sleep poorly in response to alcohol. A poor night of sleep, this is its own topic of a metabolic classroom, is capable of causing insulin resistance. So let me just restate that. Even one bad night of sleep will cause demonstrable, obvious, quantifiable insulin resistance in humans the next day. Now, thankfully, one bad night can be corrected by one good night, but as you can imagine, as you continue to compound one bad night after another, the insulin resistance is a little stickier. One good night isn't going to be enough to wipe it out. And that is overwhelmingly a result of the stress hormones, particularly cortisol. So one bad night of sleep increases cortisol the next day, and cortisol will cause insulin resistance rather quite directly. And as you know from previous metabolic classrooms, cortisol is one of the primary causes of insulin resistance. Independent of any other stimulus, cortisol can cause insulin resistance, and just as a point of interest, does so by increasing ceramides within the cells of the body. Now, unrelated to insulin resistance is stress. Now, stress is a big term. It's a kind of blanket term that within pop culture has taken on a lot of dimensions that are sometimes used inappropriately and other times precisely. So with stress, when I say stress, I really mean the stress hormones. I can't help but think about stress as a hormone response or an endocrine situation. And specifically, there are two primary stress hormones in the body: cortisol and epinephrine, also known as adrenaline. I'll call it epinephrine. That's the more technical term that's used. So cortisol and epinephrine. These hormones are actually totally unrelated. They are produced in different cell types. They are they're produced very differently. They're very different types of hormones. They move through the blood in different ways. They actually act on different cells throughout the body in different ways and have different effects throughout the body. The one thing they have in common is that they both want to increase blood glucose. And so if you have these stress hormones that are trying to push glucose up, there's another hormone that now has to work even harder to bring the glucose down. And of course, that's insulin. And so it's no surprise then that if these stress hormones are continually pushing up the glucose, the body's becoming more insulin resistant. Now, what are some of the causes of stress? This can be something as benign as sleep deprivation and insomnia. One bad night of sleep will significantly increase cortisol the next day, which causes insulin resistance that next day. Now, thankfully, one good night of sleep wipes that all out. But sleep deprivation is a simple and very common cause of stress on the body, which has a metabolic consequence. Tragic when you couple it with the poor sleep, which is excessive caffeine consumption. That if someone's taking in too much caffeine, perhaps to try to make up for or to feel better with the lack of sleep, then that increases the other stress hormone, the epinephrine. And when epinephrine goes up now, it's trying to push up glucose, which then makes insulin work harder. And so it's easy to see how a person can fall into this vicious cycle of sleeping poorly, taking caffeine to make up for it, which just continues to drive this insulin resistance. And again, this is something that happens in humans. You give humans a load of cortisol or cortisol-like molecule, give them epinephrine, and then try to treat them with insulin. They'll need much more insulin to bring their glucose down to what would have been just a modest amount of insulin prior to the introduction of the stress hormones. Same with animals and same with cells. Having done those experiments myself, you treat the cells with those molecules and they become insulin resistant. Now, the third and final of the primary causes, I leave in the final pole position, if you will, in order to just really emphasize it, because it's the one that I believe is over time, chronically, the most relevant of all of them. And that is chronically elevated insulin. Now, let me just introduce a brief tangent where some people will say, or they'll want to think that I'm saying any insulin spike is bad and should be avoided at all costs. That's not what I'm saying. But I want someone to appreciate the impact of multiple insulin spikes that are stacked together. Now, to elaborate on that, if someone eats a load of carbohydrate, because protein and fat are generally going to have elicit no insulin response. If someone eats pure carbohydrate, insulin will come up, and the insulin will take usually about 2 hours to come back down. In an insulin-sensitive person, maybe between 2 and 3 hours until the insulin comes back down to normal. Now, remember, the reason I'm talking about this is because too much insulin causes insulin resistance. You can do this in humans, you can do this in rodents and in cells. And I've done it not in humans, but others have. Give humans an infusion of insulin and then give them a few hours and the insulin starts working worse and worse and worse. So it's increasingly resistant, the body is to it. So you have the person who gets an insulin response to a carbohydrate load. Unfortunately, the average person not only eats a very starchy, sugary breakfast, but they do the same thing with a mid-morning snack. And so right around the time insulin's about to come back down to its fasted levels, we have a culture of incessant snacking and eating. They spike it right back up. Then they spike it right back up and they do it again. They do it for lunch. They do it for an afternoon snack. They do it for dinner. They do it for their evening snack. So every waking moment is spent in a state of elevated insulin. Elevated insulin causes insulin resistance.
Your question was, why would I need a D level? Well, here's what happens. First, your sleep gets better if we're successful and your back pain goes away and your menstrual cycle starts to be regular and all these things happen to you. And then things start to get screwed up and you don't really know if it went too low or if it's now too high because they feel very similar. That means over time, the next step is, okay, these three things have come back. Let's do your D level and see where it is. And I want you to remember what it feels like. I'll use myself as an example. For the last 3 years or so, when my D falls from 63 to 58, I start to get a visual aura of migraine. I get this weird flickery thing that's like a quintessential textbook visual aura of migraine. And then I start to get a little headache after it. It's not terrible. In the background, I knew I had migraine. But the weird thing is my brain still knows the difference between 63 and 58, which is mind-boggling for me, okay? Now, that doesn't mean that every single person needs to have a D level of 65. It means that I still tell people, look, if your body says X, and it's different than what I tell you happened in 8,000 other people, your body is always right, okay? So let's think about it in the proper way, which is, these are the observation in all these other people. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the case for you. But the fascinating part for me has been that this observation has been relatively constant throughout. Okay. Now, there are other modifiers that you need to know about. But the reason why you need that is to say, okay, well, I just found out that my D level went to 85. And then you write down what the symptoms were that came back. Because then the next thing you do is to say, okay, now I have 2 data points. These are the symptoms I had when my D was too low. These are the symptoms that came right back when my D was too high. So then you actually have a level to go to reassure yourself that what I should do now is to go up or go down.
And so then if things get wonky again, and if we test that marker and it's within range, so then we can actually sort of consider that maybe it's probably not vitamin D, and then consider other factors. So that makes a lot of sense.
I had this ridiculously medicine-based fantasy that D was the thing that was deficient, and you're just going to give vitamin D. And keep in mind that I believe that even one hormones don't fix people. Sleep fixes people. Sleep is extraordinarily complicated, and what you're doing is you're repairing every single organ in your body. That is extremely complicated. Now, one of the things that I saw when I first started was all I had was CPAP. I just became fascinated with sleep, and I noticed that when they started to use CPAP, their diabetes went away. They went down to 1 hypertensive medicine. Their cholesterol went down. Well, the pulmonologists, the lung doctors that were assigned this problem, because the nurses called them when they stopped breathing originally, are telling us it's drops in oxygen. None of my patients had drops in oxygen. It's not that. It's staying in these deeper restorative phases of sleep. The complexity of what is happening throughout your body when you get into those phases is truly overwhelming. You're really mentioning all of it. Now, if you start with that as your final goal, 1, I believe that sleep is a better doctor than any doctor. In fact, doctors are trained to put a Band-Aid on a thing that went wrong.
Right.
The body is designed to keep anything from going wrong. That's miraculous. That means when I'm approaching it from that way, every time a person comes in with something going wrong, their sleep should be addressed. That means when I start to do these studies and the CPAP is not needed because they don't have apnea, and these are all young, healthy people, they're probably at the beginning of this. And everything about this is the brain. That means I start to look for the brain. And then I start wondering, well, what's happening in this part of the brain stem where those D receptors are? Why are these people not getting paralyzed correctly? That's really a neurologic problem. That's not an airway problem. So I'm thinking about it in a totally different way. And then I do D, and the D makes them better, everything I just told you. And then at the end of 2 years, after Walter and I published this article, everything falls apart. I'm like, whoa, I start to get this weird buttock pain. My sleep is a little worse because I'm thinking of the D as something that's pivotal to make repairs. Because I'm thinking about it looking through the sleep lens, okay? I'm looking at it in a different way. I'm saying, okay, we're sleeping better. I don't want them to be unconscious. They're not laying there like a lump. They're making repairs in their body. That means they'll need more magnesium, more calcium. They're making these repairs. They will actually need all more of the B vitamins. They'll need more A and more E because every single one of those components that are pivotal for our cellular function, every single one of those, their need for them goes up.
I think that depression, we see a lot of depression in adolescents these days, both male and female.
Yeah.
ADHD, young boys and girls are put on Ritalin and ADHD medications because they're not concentrating. So that to me, that would be blood sugar issues, which again goes to the adrenals and possibly the thyroid.
Eating butter lowers cortisol. And that's something that I personally have felt when I'm stressed out or I feel a little bit irritable. I eat butter straight out of the fridge and I feel immediately better. Could you go more in depth about that, Dr. Bright?
We make all our steroid hormones out of cholesterol. So that's the master ingredient. And it has to be animal fat. And as different steroid hormones are metabolized, your endocrine system responds by making cortisol for you to adapt to the stress, to handle the stress, not to freeze in fight or flight mode, right? You don't want to freeze because then you'll get eaten. So you send vasomotor, you have a hot flash, your liver is producing sugar for you to have energy to run. All that's happening and your cortisol is really high. So the fat will address that by replenishing the stress response. So you don't run out of the stress response, because running out of the stress response is stressful. And there's a study that they did with athletes, 2 weeks on a high-fat diet and 2 weeks on a high-carb diet. And they pushed them to the max. And obviously, exercising, training raises your cortisol level because your body sees it as stress. And those that ate a high-fat diet, they measured their cortisol levels over a 2-week period, had lower cortisol levels.
Oh my goodness. So could we say that fat is like an aphrodisiac? No. We just have a little something going that way, gets everybody relaxed in a calm state.
Yeah. Well, I talked to a woman today who said her eyes lit up when she started eating fat. So I just think it's energy, really. Everything needs energy.
Yes.
So there's ways to actually measure cortisol?
Yes, absolutely. Not blood, not serum. Salivary cortisol is the best way.
Salivary. Okay, that's good.
You might want to measure your circadian rhythm. So your cortisol, your adrenals produce, your adrenal cortex, which is the part of the adrenal, not the medulla, produces the cortisol. It starts producing about 2 a.m, very gentle, amount of cortisol, and it's supposed to peak in the morning. So it's a gentle rise. The people that wake at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning are having cortisol spikes because it's not able to make this gentle upward curve until you reach this apex in the morning. And then that's when it's supposed to be higher. And then it gently goes down until nighttime when you go to sleep. And that's when melatonin is produced. So you can't have melatonin and cortisol at the same time. It's one or the other. So if cortisol levels are high at night, you won't sleep. You'll be wired but tired.
Wired but tired.
And the way to measure that is to do a salivary cortisol test. I always recommend a 4-point salivary cortisol test to see if you're able to follow the rhythm.
Ooh.
Oh, I love that.
And so what this reserve, like this fat reserve that we're kind of replenishing, it just helps smooth, nice, smooth, even journey.
Yeah, it smooths it out. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
People are really suffering with anxiety. They are really suffering with depression. They are really suffering with sleep. They are really suffering with attention problems. The question is why? Is it overdiagnosed? I don't know, maybe. But my guess is that most people, and my experience tells me that most people are truly suffering. It's just a matter of degree. And it's also a matter of, okay, why? And why should medicines be our first instinct? Shouldn't our first instinct be a food first, lifestyle first, natural? Let's see if we can optimize brain health in all of these ways. Simple, not easy, but all of these use these simple principles to shore up brain health before we start to think about medicines. Medicines are great for emergency situations. They're great for certain very special and complex situations. They have their place. But for most people who are suffering with low risk symptoms of depression, anxiety, irritability, moodiness, eating concerns, sleep disorders, attention problems, memory issues, for most people who have low risk conditions, why not a food first approach? Why not start there? So there are a variety of different factors involved in supporting good sleep architecture and good sleep quality. So this includes circadian rhythm factors, making sure you're getting sunlight every day, making sure you're prioritizing sleep time, making sure the environment in your room, all these sleep hygiene things that we always hear about, relaxing, not spending time on screens at night, not eating too close to bedtime, making sure your room is cool and comfortable. All of those things are very important. But what if you're already doing all of those things and you're still not able to sleep? Because this is what I heard in my practice for years is my patients will say, I'm already doing all of those things. And that's when they would come to me and say, I need a sleep medication, right? And I would, of course, prescribe it for them. Now, what I think about is the profound influence of food choices and especially the metabolic influence, the nutritional metabolic influence of the diet on brain chemistry, which can disrupt sleep. So what are the things that disrupt sleep? Caffeine disrupts sleep, alcohol disrupts sleep, blood sugar and insulin roller coaster affects sleep, cortisol levels affect sleep, so stress, and your food choices are playing a direct role how much melatonin your brain actually makes. So this is just one example. So there's a chemical pathway in the brain, which is I go through in the book in more detail, but there's a chemical pathway in the brain called the kynurenine pathway that is responsible for regulating the activity of a variety of different neurotransmitters in the brain, and one of them is melatonin. And so if you have too much on oxidative stress or inflammation, which you can, things that cause oxidative stress and inflammation are things like refined carbohydrates and vegetable oils, but also smoking and alcohol and pollution, exposure to environmental toxins. All it takes is some oxidation, inflammation, stress, a little bit more than you should have, to trigger this phenomenon called the tryptophan steal, where tryptophan, which is an essential amino acid that's used to that we need to build dietary that comes from dietary protein, is used to build a lot of different neurotransmitters, including melatonin. And if you are under the influence of inflammation or oxidative stress, you get this tryptophan steal, where less tryptophan is used to build melatonin and serotonin molecules, and more of it goes down this kynurenine pathway to produce tremendous quantities of glutamate. And glutamate is the brain's gas pedal. It will throw the brain into overdrive and can be not just physically damaging to the brain's architecture, but also very destabilizing for mood and attention. People can become anxious or irritable, moody. You can even see hypomania and insomnia because the brain is overstimulated by too much glutamate. So this is just one example of how not having the right information about food can profoundly destabilize brain chemistry, to the point that the only thing that people think is going to help is either having alcohol before they go to sleep to try to relax themselves, or taking a melatonin supplement, or taking a sleep medication. And so, yes, people need to sleep more, but if we don't give them the information they need to correct their sleep architecture, they will turn to either alcohol or sleeping pills to try to correct that very serious problem. If you're not getting enough sleep, you are not going to do well the next day. Right. So it's important. Yeah, I understand why people turn to these things.